Hey guys, we're welcome to an emergency episode of Conspire a Theory. I have with me a special guest, Annie, the review girl from WATP, as well as What Is This Game show on YouTube. How's it going, Annie?
Great, thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me come on for this emergency episode. Uh, it, Everybody has to do one around John. He is surprisingly a huge magnet for drama, and love him or hate him, he is a constant source of entertainment.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about not just John, who we're going to be introducing to our audience, but two other challengers have entered the ring that are noteworthy, very noteworthy, that we will be discussing. We will be discussing of course, the trifecta or triforce of drama, three characters: Stuttering John, Eric D. July, and one Aaron Imholte. I noticed this. The idea first came for this episode when I think it was on Twitter. The guy who had posted he had gone to Isom Knox's grave, a guy who does video moronic opinions. He had taken the picture, a selfie at Isom's grave, which of course, if you're not familiar with the Eric drama, just give us a few minutes. We will get there. It's the and he was on Twitter, and me and him were discussing back and forth, and once you know it, the guy is a dabbler. He happens to be a dabbler, and then me and him were going back and forth doing this comparative like character study of John and Eric July, how they seem to have these behavioral parallels. And that gave me the idea for this episode. And I needed to find someone who was well versed in all three of these characters. And I thought, who do I know? Who do I know? And then I see you make an Eric July comment in one of the WATPs, and I said, oh, I got to snag Annie. She's gonna. I need someone that's familiar with this, so that way we can go back and forth and discuss it. So, as far
I
as
definitely am pretty familiar with the whole situation. I am a huge fan of Who Are These Podcasts or WATP.
mhm.
I'm a big fan of the Dick Show, TDS, and The Biggest Problem in the Universe, which is Dick Masterson and Vito Gesualdi. Now, again, you can love or hate these people. I think they put on a good show. Would I hang out with them in real life? I don't know, probably. But, that's just me. So yeah, I definitely am familiar with the Eric July side of the drama because I'm a big fan of
Mhm.
the Biggest Problem in the Universe. And it's interesting that you brought up moronic opinions because a character that we'll touch on in a little bit is his name is Riley. He often gets conflated and confused with the person that ended up going to Isam's grave. Now, he's a huge July detractor, but he is not the one who went on the grave, and he's also not the one who pissed on it. That was not piss.
Yeah, that never happened. That was I guess a old wives' tale that, of course, got conflated. That now everyone grasps onto it as real. Just like the old wives' tale of Stuttering John stating, "Oh, they mess with my kids. They're goofing on my kids," and people don't goof on his kids. But let's go ahead and introduce the audience to these characters, sort of lay down the groundwork, because not every dabbler is a detractor, but not every detractor is a dabbler. So let's go ahead and introduce. Let me start with Stuttering John. Stuttering John is sort of he was on the Howard Stern show for quite some time, and then eventually he had a sort of cultural renaissance through WATP, which made him relevant, and now it's sort of cascaded into its own drama's community, which is referred to as the Dabbleverse. John has come into it and in a way embraced it, but also he sees himself as its lord and master, which is causing many of contention
The
and
Duke of the
drama.
Dabbleverse, he calls himself. The GOAT.
Uh,
Any sort of name that you can feel that I'm surprised he's not calling himself Emperor Melendez yet.
give it time, give it time. And then there is the character of Eric D. July, who is I was an avid fan of and supporter of up until
Is
the
the D for
I
dumbass?
it is now. Whether it be dumbass or dickhead, or just all around dumb fuck. The the D tonight is for drama. So I would have
Eric
to
July
say
is a comic book man. He is a indie
he is
comic
now.
well, he was indie, I guess.
Yes,
He started off with a like sort of Kickstarter crowdfunder to get his comic, the titular ISOM, off the ground. And the initial Kickstarter did fantastic, actually. It raised around like
absolutely.
$3 million. After tax, we'll figure out what that's worth. But it raised like $3 million on paper. And it was looking to be a huge, awesome, project. And people started looking in at Eric July as a writer and looking at some of the people he was hiring to do some of the comic books, and scrutiny was laid on him that we're not necessarily sure if this will be a good comic book. You raised a lot of money, but
Well,
you're not
the
necessarily, it doesn't look like it's quite the product that you raised the money for yet.
well, the thing is, I think his first initial critic was Vito Gesualdi. And of course, Vito is a very divisive, trigger happy. I call him a rage baiter.
Oh,
That's what
definitely.
I'm not
Good,
a
good
I'm not a
descriptor.
big fan of his. I mean, I respect the comedy and stuff, but I have my criticisms of him. He has blocked me numerous times on Twitter for antics. But the thing is that he was initially very critical, and I believe he was. I need to make note of this is because I think this is being forgotten by history, that this was spurred on by one Tony from Hack the Movies, who said, hey, Vito, you got to support black businesses and all this stuff. And as we're seeing later on, I believe as much as like a personified Sonichu medallion, this Tony from Hack the Movies character, he seems to be sort of like the puppet master of all this drama. And I feel that he is a hidden catalyst of this, and he deserves very much scorn and adulation. Is like, how dare you? But he seems to be a hidden figure who seems to walk away from this scotch free. But will go scotched earth on him, maybe sooner or later. But the initial point is that when the book had come out, everyone, like I'd say, for about a full year, no, not a full year, maybe about several months, everyone was talking about buying it and having it, but nobody was talking about reading it until
None of
Nina
the
and
content. Nobody was giving it a review.
yes,
Nobody was saying, "Oh, well, what was their favorite part?" Nobody could
yeah,
mention like, what was their favorite part of the comic book. And it became sort of a point of contention that, well, if you can't A, say what your favorite part is, and B, you can't describe any part of the plot or even really tell me what Isom is or what his powers are, maybe you didn't read it, and
exactly.
maybe you're just propping it up as a sort of, to use their words, alternate economy.
Well, I think Dick Masterson had the best description, which was a culture war trophy. And
Mhm.
I'll admit that's why I bought it. I bought it as a culture war trophy because I'm deep into the culture war. And
You have a copy of Isom?
I absolutely do. It's in my
Sweet.
back box somewhere. I got a copy of Isom and I got a copy of Yaira. And I think I've opened both of them like once since I've owned them. But the thing is that the initial criticism, Eric July, it was very, I would say it was very mild and understandable, given that it's his first professional outing as a comic writer. But instead of taking his lumps and he could have winged it into a way that would have garnished him more support, but instead he spazzed out and just through everything, just flipped the table, so to speak. And that led to what is now the current detractor movement. And
Right. He
then
did
we
not
have
handle any of his criticism well at all. He would threaten people. He would call them certain language. He
yeah,
would
slurs. He would
he would
throw.
straight up just block people and then get people to go and make fun of that person on his behalf. Now,
Mhm.
I can't prove that last part, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, well, we'll see evidence of that later, as we will bring up during our deeper analysis of him. And then let's bring in our third contender, which is Aaron Imholte. Now, again, this is another character where I was a huge fan. I have done numerous fan arts, like I
Wait, were
think
you a
three or
fan of
four.
John?
I was not a fan of John's.
Okay,
I
so you're
didn't
a fan of
even.
Eric and you're a fan of Aaron. Gotcha. I just want to make sure
Yes,
which ones we were talking about.
yes, I was a fan of Aaron. I was on the Steel Toe morning show stuff when initially when he was on his first round or bout with one Eric or Zumach, Chad Zumach. When he was going up against
Mhm.
Chad Zumach, I was, on his side, and I sort of like, again, I love the character of Chad Zumach. I thought it was fun, drama and stuff like this, but apparently, I guess it was too much for Aaron, and at the time, his wife April, and they had bowed out,
I
which
miss you, April.
which for a lot of people was sort of the turning point where then everyone turned on him, where I can kind of understand that, but to the degree of which people had turned on, he very much in pattern, like an Eric July type, has, taken that criticism and, just spurged out, so to speak. What is your initial impressions of Aaron?
Well, my initial impressions were uh, over a year ago. I had no idea who he was, and I remember Carl from WATP, the host of the show. He asked me when I was on an episode. He's like, "What do you think of Steel Toe?" And I was like, "I don't know. I don't know anything about Aaron and girl Aaron." And Carl's like April, and I was like, "Whatever. I have no idea. That I tuned out. Their show's boring." I think it was basically what I was saying.
Yeah,
And I only really started watching Steel Toe and Steel Toe stuff through Patrick Melton from Nobody Likes
exactly.
Onions.
As
He
have I.
is currently the number one at dissecting Aaron and just ripping apart every single frame of his show.
Much like the
So I've
Saskas,
had
he
a
is
lot of
the
exposure to
keeper of the law.
Aaron from Patrick.
Yeah, yeah. I described Patrick as sort of he is a keeper of the lore as far as Steel Toe goes. One of the things that I do like about Patrick Melton is, he's pretty much on his own planet, as far as, the connections with everybody goes, but he has the most grounded takes on any of this drama that I have ever heard from anyone, which is really surprising because a guy who's so, detached from it that he doesn't need to get in the folds of any of it to make it happen. With like say with Stuttering John, there has to be some initial interaction and back and forth, like be it Shuley or Carl or any of these other characters of the Dabbleverse. There, you got to poke the dabbler every now and then to squeeze some sweet drama juice out of him.
Don't poke the bear.
Whereas with the character of I guess it with Patrick, though, he really doesn't do anything. You can pretty much ignore him, but people choose not to, which of course, just only emboldens him. And in a way, I think it was Patrick made the claim that he had pretty much stolen Aaron's audience because Aaron kept spurging out. And I do believe that is true. I think that is very understandable because Aaron, much like Eric July, um, used various communities and fandoms as stepping stones to his own success. Eric, in the grounds that he used the consumer movement Comicsgate, which was started by Ethan Van Sciver and other various independents who had been ousted by the politically leaning, left leaning comic mainstream industry. They had formed their own movement called Comicsgate, which they then, had a rather large following. Eric then, he buddied up with them, used that audience to prop himself up, and even though this will probably be argued, I believe that half of his sales were Comicsgate. As soon as he pissed them off, that those people disappeared,
Well,
and he
yeah,
pissed
because
them off.
initially, like I said, the Kickstarter did really well. Everybody believed
Mhm.
in the movement, and then the people who got the comic, who actually read it, didn't really like it. And then the people who didn't read it and were supporting Eric, whenever he started, as you used, spurging out on the internet and calling people the N word, and just absolutely just lashing out at anyone who had any sort of criticism. People were like, "Oh, maybe the comic is good, but I don't want to be associated with him or his fan base anymore because, whoo, that's not, yeah."
Yeah, yeah, and to sort of bring this back to Aaron, Aaron sort of did that with the Dabbleverse. He used the Dabbleverse. He used, I guess, Kumia. He got in with Kumia and sort of used his, because Kumia he enjoys the Dabbleverse. He sort of like he comes in and Anthony Kumia from Opie and Anthony days. He comes in and he'll hang out with the dabblers and have fun with it. He makes frequent appearances on the Uncle Rico show and all of that stuff. And he,
He will be coming to
he's all.
DabbleCon too, August 16th and 17th in Rochester.
Yeah, that's right. And then even at the first DabbleCon, I think Aaron and April they said they were going to go. And even though I've argued with Carl on this, yeah, Carl, he says they weren't, quote unquote, on the itinerary or like officially invited as guests, but I'm going off of them saying we'll be there, and then they didn't show up, and I think that's because. I believe at the time the criticism is that, well, they had already garnished their deal with Kumia, and as a result, they didn't feel they didn't need to placate to that audience anymore. That's one of the
Exactly. Not,
criticisms I heard.
not that they wanted to or whatever. They just like, oh, we don't need to. It's fine. Which I feel like is a big missing out because, um, Aaron, he can be pretty good at making fun of somebody. He doesn't make any good points or whatever, but he makes a lot of noise. He points a lot of things out. He might have. I believe he was on an episode of WATP. Apparently, I spaced out and missed it. But
No, he was on a
he
few.
might be.
Yes.
He might have been a decent regular co-host if he would have tried to stick around and leech on the Carl and his show. Would I have liked it? Probably not. I don't like Aaron, and I don't think he's a good personality on the air. But he could have tried. But as you said, he said, I don't need that. I have this stuff with Kumia, so I can just latch onto that because Kumia is bigger and has more of an influence.
Well, yeah, I would then make the argument that Aaron seems to be a bit of a leech. He will latch onto all these communities and in a way sort of embody them in a way to try to placate to them. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is a bit of crossover, is maybe this leads into like other drama avenues that we will be discussing, is that there was an event where Aaron and Nick were at, where they sort of had this sort of thing at Stoney's bar, and Aaron had done some stand up, and Riley was in attendance. And I believe that Riley, he had sort of massaged Aaron to go after Eric July. And at the time, it was pretty harmful, but because I'm an avid detractor, I had noticed all of Aaron's, stand up and all of his criticisms of Eric were all just surface level, effortless stuff. It's like, oh, the black guy does a thing, blah blah blah, and it's not. He wasn't being funny. It was more he was just shooting from the hips and missing each time. It wasn't. It's like he
Sounds like
was there,
Stuttering
but
John.
yeah, he was there, but he wasn't trying. He wasn't putting any real effort into it. And my criticism, well, he's not versed in this. He's just shooting his mouth off. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not really. He's just trying to, latch on to this detractor movement like he did the Dabbleverse. And I think it eventually petered out and it kind of got like exposed. I don't know. His audience didn't grow as a result of it. And like, he sort of, just let go of it and moved on. But he
I think
did
a big
try.
hindrance to I think a big hindrance to Aaron's audience growing is Aaron's show format. If you've watched it or watched Melton talk about it, for the most part, all it is talking about the show itself and asking for money, which, I mean, I guess works for like a telethon, but he does 2 shows a day and doesn't do any show.
Well, he, for a time, his show was sort of a show. I would come home from work after work and I would tune it on. I would catch the Steel Toe Morning Show. It was general news. And then him and April would, of course, goof on the news, news of the day, news items, various, pod filter, whatever it is, this funny thing happened today, blah, 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 and stuff like that. And it was, for the most part, pretty entertaining. But then it became less and less, let's talk about the news, and more he's desperately trying to placate to these audiences. I think he tried to heavily placate to the Kumia audience, which he believes is just old racists, where he had this stick figure character thing called I don't know, some racial Toby or something like that, and he would make it dance, and it was like a garden gnome type of lawn jockey thing, and he would just run off of that. And he, of course, he thought it was hilarious because, again, he's playing to what he thinks the compound audience is, and that sort of went nowhere. And I think, in an effort to, this is my personal conspiracy theory, but I believe that Carl had given Aaron sort of a year's worth of diplomatic immunity where
Hmm.
he did not
Yeah,
go
kind
after
of.
him. And even Blind Mike, a man with no eyes, even he points out, for a year he didn't talk about this guy. He says one thing, then Eric comes out and like, fuck you. Even Blind Mike had noticed this in one of his prior episodes. And the excuse that Carl had used when I had confronted him about this in behind closed doors was sort of, he saw the anti-Aaron movement as very, dark, and intimidating and stuff of that nature. And I'm like, it's like, well, we're with what we're dealing with here with Stuttering John, it can't be any much lower than that. You can't, we're already in the mud, so to speak. And I can
Yeah, I
understand
mean,
that.
it is pretty low. Like it when if you just step away for like 2 steps to look at the situation with John, it's a bunch of internet weirdos making fun of a washed up 60-year-old who is destroying himself with alcohol and yelling at anyone who crosses him. Like
Exactly.
it's a very sad situation. There's very little comedy to be drawn from it from just that description.
Exactly. And as far as the Aaron stuff, I mean, I can understand. It was my belief that because of Aaron's association with Kumia, that he was sort of, that they sort of see Kumia as this sort of father figure. And of course, he doesn't, what father figure wants his stepchildren fighting? So I sort of extended that onto it, and that's my impression of it. Carl is free to say otherwise, and I believe that he has, but it's just my initial impression of the thing so far. I mean, the fact remains that there is this huge gap of steel toe criticism that exists prior to the initial other shoe that dropped, which was April leaving the show. And then that led into another e drama segment where I guess people would sort of want to include Nick Rekieta as sort of a fourth character in this sort of, to square out the drama trifecta into a drama quadrant. But I see Nick Rekieta more as Aaron's victim in the initial Flashpoint incident, where I see Nick as a Flashpoint that sort of unified these universes. Like I think it was, remember that Flashpoint movie, or at least I've seen clips of it, where they have all these universes flying around and they crash into each other. That's what the Nick
Vaguely.
Rekieta innocent was. What the incident was, that where we have all these universes clashing in, and it's mostly the super chatters that are drawing all this stuff together. Where, on Milton's show you see a bunch of people attacking, Dick Masterson. They pump up because Dick Masterson went to Milton's event Hackamania, and it's like, and because of that, all the anti-Dick people went to Melton and started, spamming his chat with anti-Dick show type of stuff. And as same when Ricada came back, people were dabblers were spamming his super chats, with like Ray DeVito and KB drama stuff like this. So it was sort of like crossing of the streams, and it was pretty fun. It was pretty neat, in a sort of way. But these universes they've never really touched before.
Not directly, no. Everything's kind of indirect for these people.
Yeah, and it is sort of like an interesting thing. I see sort of these characters as sort of like Frankenstein's monster, where the prototype, the first generation, is Stuttering John. He is the sort of monster. He goes out, he
He's
reigns
turning into a monster. Thank you, Andy.
he is sort of reigning he has his reign of terror, and then he goes on about, and he's sort of fizzing out. And then the modern Prometheus is Eric July. He is sort of the latest generation of the Frankenstein's monster, and he is currently going further and higher than I think currently Stuttering John has. And as far within the current culture, and then Aaron, like twins, if the movie Twins, the Danny DeVito character was sort of the crap, and I sort of see Aaron as that, where he's sort of an attempt, but he's more of leftovers that have just been left to their own devices.
I feel like that's an apt description. Aaron is definitely leftovers, and his show kind of represents that, because it is now currently just a rehashing of everything that's happened earlier today and yesterday and what he wants to happen tomorrow. There is no show anymore. It's all just a slurry of just whatever anyone else is talking about.
Yeah, because since April pretty much left him for Nick Rekieta, and it's sort of like the criticism there is sort of, well, they buddied together because Chrissy Mayer was going to do an event. She wasn't able to make it, and Chrissy Mayer, she's had a lot going on in her life, and she is the queen of the Dabbleverse. She's sort of like, the Dabble name came from her, where during an interview with Stuttering John, she said, "Do you dabble in stand-up comedy?" Because he doesn't carry himself like a stand-up comic, even though
He
he
also doesn't
claims he is.
he doesn't tour really. He doesn't promote gigs. He doesn't really open for somebody. Like, as shit as Chad Zumach is, he does go do comedy. As shit as Ray DeVito is, he does go do comedy. He does
Yeah,
go perform. That's what they do. Stuttering
yeah,
John might have done it. He might like to do it. He might want to do it. But at the time, he wasn't currently doing it. And it wasn't like anyone that, any of these comics that are touring, they're like, oh, the other day I was playing at this place, and who was there? Was Stuttering John. He did like a 5-minute set. It was kind of crazy. No, you never heard
yeah,
any of those stories. So when Chrissy Mayer says, oh, so you dabble in comedy, he takes that as a personal offense, because he sees himself as this great comedian who is so funny and everything he says kills, because he made
yeah,
Obama laugh.
yeah. He didn't do the work. He does not do the work, even currently, and even to this day, he now uses the Dabbleverse as a crutch. Like, well, I can't do the work because these guys get my gigs canceled. Well, it's like in one incident, which was I think in a Corpus Christi comedy show or comedy bar, they had closed up his show because I think there weren't enough tickets. And of course, it got out that I think one person had called, or there was an email or something of that nature that said, if you have Stuttering John, we'll commit violence against women or something obnoxious and stupid.
All women. Every
Yeah.
woman is going to get violenced.
Yeah. And then, of course, Stuttering John uses that to say, oh, they get my gigs canceled. And he's been, using that ever since as the sort of talking points. The same thing with where he had said that Bob, I think first it was Muttering Jay, then it was Bob, then it goes back and forth on who he's currently at war with had gotten his teaching gig. gotten him fired from teaching, which now he claims he never got fired from teaching. So, which means he's pretty much lying. But it's this thing where he goes back and forth, and bringing up Bob Levy, who in his day, I'm sure was a very divisive, angsty character, has now become a cute old man.
Right, he
And
used to apparently
yeah,
be like the roast master general or whatever. And I never watched Stern. All of my Stern knowledge comes from the Dabbleverse.
exactly. Mine too.
Honestly, so I have no idea, but that's what I've heard it, referred to as. That he did good on the show, making fun of callers and stuff like that. So anytime people needed to be made fun of, apparently Bob would come in. But now I kind of agree with you. He's just like this silly, weird old man. Like it. I love the Uncle Rico show because they shit on John constantly. But
Well, they are the best.
Bob
They are
on
the
that
best.
show, you're right. He's just that guy in the corner who is just like, what, huh? And he's just like that
Yeah,
goofy old man character. And
yeah.
I remember when I
He's
was first being introduced to Bob Levy and Kevin Brennan, whenever they were doing Misery Loves Company together, I
mhm.
asked a chatter, I was like, so who's the old man? And they're like, no, that's Kevin Brennan. I was like, wait, Kevin Brennan is the funny old man? I thought Kevin Brennan was the yelling guy. And he's like, no, he is the yelling guy, but he's also the old man. I'm like, no, the guy on the guy that doesn't say anything, the old man,
the other old man.
the actual old man. So
Uh,
it's funny because that's exactly what I thought when I first saw Bob, and I was like, "Oh, he's just like the
yeah, yeah.
the goofy old man character."
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Brennan, he is a sort of character as well, a sort of tentpole of the Dabbleverses, of this very verse type stuff. But Kevin, on the other hand, he's not harmful, in a way. Yeah, he talks shit and stirs up drama and all that stuff, but he's not really doing anything. He's not, as
He's
far
not a
as I
man of
don't know.
action.
Yeah, yeah. The worst thing that he'll do is he'll not write someone a check. That seems to be, what sends these people into a frenzy is he doesn't write them a check.
Well, that's
The
because it starts off with him holding the money over them. Kevin Brennan will, be like, you can come get $500 to come on my show, and then the next show he gives him $200, and the next show he has $100, and he'll just keep them there. And $100 is better than nothing. And then when he pays them nothing, they're suddenly like, "Whoa, what the fuck? What, am I just worthless now?" It's like, no, I'm just not paying
yeah,
you.
yeah, and the thing is that it's up to you whether or not you want to go on that stuff. But I to sort of like get take it back to Bob, is that Bob, he is this cute old man, and then I think at the time during the first Eric Chad Zumach versus Aaron bout, um, I guess Chad was going after Aaron's ex-wife, and he was sort of making fun of her, but he really wasn't in any communication with her. However, because Aaron has so much thin skin, he raged out and he sent. This is going to be a recurring theme. He sent Bob and them and the crew a night letter. He said, if you guys don't this or that, if you guys don't call Chad off of me, you're gonna get blowback of some sorts. And it's heavily implied that there's probably some legal action that he's gonna engage in. And that sent, it I believe that was the initial catalyst that got Aaron, pretty much booted from the Dabbleverse, not just the snub, but the initial night letter, got him booted. Just as how in the parallel, Eric July sent a night letter to Ethan Van Sciver and said, I think it was his first confrontation with Dick Dot Show, in the famous Flashcast highlight where Dick is confronting Eric on his with his initial criticism. And EVS comes up and says, "Hey, you got to listen to this guy. His notes are pretty good." And then after that, it was then that Eric had sent a night letter to EVS saying, "You had better get online or something's going to happen to you." And it was more implied e-drama, but the initial thing is a night letter was sent. And that's sort of where these two characters parallel. And as we see with Stuttering John, he is constantly sending, night letters, be it to Kate Meany or any of these other people, saying you had better, don't you know? But with John, it's more of don't you know who I am type of thing. It's just an extension of that. He
With John,
threatens
it's a little bit
lawsuits all the time.
different too, in my opinion, because with the other two, they have uh, to give them credit, and this is a little disingenuous, but at least they have a target, they have a plan, they have an idea, they have a motive. None of them do anything
Yes.
with it, but they have one specific target and one specific threat. With Stuttering John, a good example of something recent is Andrea Brower, an ex moderator for him, is coming out and saying things about him, and he has nothing to say about her because everybody knows everything about Andrea Brower. But now that she's talking again, he's threatening her friends. He's threatening other people that have no relation to her directly, really. They're just people related through John. He's assaulting anyone he can get his hands on. He's like crabs in a bucket.
Yeah, he's right. Basically, anybody who doesn't leave him on red, type of thing, and anybody that actually answers the call or whatever, he gets into it with. The thing is that these sending of these night letters, and I think the recent thing that the recent overspill is now in some of these cases the law is getting involved. I mean, eventually there is, of course, the drama with Nick Rekieta getting busted in a drug bust, and a lot of people believe that it was a drug bust under the guise of a CPS call, because I mean, I've never seen a wellness check where they had a battering ram ready to go. I mean,
Well, we really have to make sure you're well.
yeah, exactly. So with that, and then which it was like a again, it was a drug raid disguised as a child service call. Nick Rekieta was, of course, busted with drugs, and he's currently in defense of that, and that is a developing issue right now. A lot of people believe that Aaron was the catalyst to that, and that drama comes
There's a lot of
from
circumstantial evidence to point to that.
exactly. And Aaron, of course, he cannot shut up about it. He used that as the sort of way of he pretty much profiteered off of it by being the
Absolutely. I feel like
inside
if that
man.
didn't happen in April and April was doing that stuff silently on the side, his show was slowly bleeding out. It was literally crawling on the side of the highway begging for help. And then Nick gets busted again, probably because of him, and suddenly his show has another month or two of topic, and it's immediately turned back into just talking about the show mostly, but
Yeah,
he does at least have something to talk about now.
exactly. And for as the show was bleeding out, mostly because I think April left the show, and of course we now learn where she
Well, yeah, because
went.
Johnny Crutches is a terrible co-host, and that other guy, whoever his name is, they're
Matt.
they're two of the most whatever. They're two of the most boring people on the planet. Matt and Johnny are impressively boring.
Yeah, well, the thing is, as Milton is digging right now, Matt used to be a man. Like I think of the scene of the GI Joe movie where Cobra Commander got turned into a snake, and he's slithering. I used to be a man. I used to be a man. I think that's what happened to Matt, and I think it was Aaron's doing, and that's showing. And go to Nobody Loves Onions to see that corner dissected, but just for the sake of getting back on topic, is that this sort of April had left the show, and she was gone for like 5-6 months. People were speculating, like what was going on with her, and even Carl, eventually was forced to weigh in, and of course he had done the infamous "It's a work." That this is a great big joke that they are doing, and then eventually she got busted at the Rekieta compound. And since then, of course, Aaron had milked that for all it's worth. And of course, one of the talking points is it a work, Carl? Used that against Carl. And of course, Carl, of course,
Way
I'll give
longer.
him credit. He took it on the teeth.
Yeah, yeah. Carl immediately was like, "Okay, okay, I was wrong." And Aaron, for like a week after Carl admits that he was wrong, Aaron's still like, "Yeah, he won't even say that he's wrong." And it took somebody confronting him to his face, being like, "No, no, he actually did." And he's like, "Oh
Yeah,
well,
and that was
I win."
Keanu. Yeah, that was
Which
that
is
was Keanu.
another Stuttering John parallel. It's funny how none of these characters are directly related, but they're all so similar. He, any chance that Aaron can get a win, he will take it. He will exploit and he will twist anything to be a win. And that was a great example. He's like literally making an ass of himself for days after Carl, and multiple times Carl says, "I was wrong." And then as soon as he's confronted and he's wrong, he's like, "Well, Carl's an idiot. I'm right. I win."
Yeah, another win for the toe. And it's this, and then that's another characteristic where he parallels with John. And I guess, and we're sort of seeing that again, that parallel also with Eric, where anything is now a win. And now what currently Eric is beating his chest about a win is the support of these characters, Kino Casino, who are ex Ralph employees, I believe. I don't know. They were in Ralph's circle. I
That's
know
Ethan
Worski
Ralph,
was. Yeah,
right?
Ethan Ralph.
Okay.
Yes, Ethan Ralph, who was sort of, he's famous for the kill stream. He's a very
Mhm.
divisive character. Uh, he's definitely a force to be reckoned with. He's sort of like in that sort of Dick Dot Show sphere, so to speak. Yeah, he has a very controversial show. He's I find him pretty hilarious. His brand of humor isn't quite to my liking, but he does a
Sometimes
great
he's really
show.
funny.
Yeah, he does. He's had his bouts with alcoholism and addiction, and I think he's currently on the rebound where he's bouncing back, and he's doing great. And he should be
He's looking
commended
and
for that.
sounding much better. He was on
Yeah,
the last episode of The Biggest Problem in the Universe, and I think he was a great fit on the show.
absolutely, absolutely. And he had a Worski was his second banana for a time. And of course, Worski is famous for the stay back, where one of his security detail pulled a gun on someone, and it was at some type of event or something, and then he's threw himself under the bus again when he challenged another YouTuber to a boxing match and then just went down in the first 5 seconds. And of course him and this character PPP, who I don't know anything about. I believe he's another Ralph-averse type of character, or
I
am
only
I
know
wrong?
him by name. I've seen him a little bit. I'm familiar with him only by really name. I have
Yeah,
no
yeah,
idea who he is.
yeah, and I'm not going to do the, because I don't know who they are doesn't mean they suck or whatever.
Hmm.
They throw on a show. It's their format is they take news items and roast them, and they have an audience. They seem to be doing pretty well together. The thing is that they are taking on, I think when Aaron was doing his rounds, his fuck Nick rounds, getting back at Nick for fucking his wife, you know, out of his marriage. He had gone on to Kino Casino, and they had sort of, they had sort of, they had sort of gotten some shine off of this somehow, because they're very anti Dick Dot Show, characters, and that pretty much defines them.
Yeah,
And
they hate that guy.
yes,
They really hate him.
yeah, and I don't know what the rift is, but it's there. And now they're sort of getting a
Do they?
second
I mean,
wind.
like, as much of a fan as I am of Dick and his show, does anybody really need a reason to not like him? I mean, you just look at his show or him as a person, and that's all. That's all. I mean, you just look at him.
Yeah, they had sort of gained a sort of second wind with Eric July now, where Eric July is sort of toting them as he's sort of, like, hey, check these guys out. He's giving them shine and giving them a shout out because they had also trashed, Dick on the review of ISOM and all of this stuff. So they're going after Eric's enemies. And I think it was initially the arrest of Riley. And this is sort of, we'll get into that, where Riley was sort of this cornball character from the Dick Show. He was a former producer. Him and Mint Salad.
Well,
They
sort
had
of. They sent in bits, and they would help with stuff behind the scene. Really calling them a producer, I feel like, is playing into the bit of the show, because Riley is the employee of the month for the Dick Show constantly, and he doesn't really even work for the show anymore. So, I mean, yes, he did help with the show and he did make things for the show, but that is like no discredit to him. But that's like saying Adam Thoreau is a producer for WATP. No,
okay.
he does
All
a
right.
fuck ton for the show, but I wouldn't really call him a producer.
All right, that's understandable. But Riley is sort of this character that has sort of come into his own, where he had this ongoing parody where he would, you know, Eric July's initial criticism, and a way to deflect criticism was, I'm not going to take criticism from fat people. And that was initially a dig at Vito Gesualdi,
Mhm.
specifically, I believe. Um, as a result of that, Riley then started this campaign where he was walking up this hill and he said, I'm going to shave you. I'll pull up to you. I'm a fat guy,
Riley made his entire persona being a parody of Eric July. Eric July is on YouTube, Young Rippa, and his comic book and his series and his fans, it's all under the Rippaverse. So Riley
Yes.
made a parody, a character called Young Clippa, because he is going to clip Eric July's arm hair and his shoulder hair. And the joke is funny because Riley's hair is longer and more out of control than Eric July's and more noticeable. So the
Yeah,
entire thing is a parody. It's a joke. It is. If you think I'm a shitty character, it's because I'm you.
exactly. And this sort of and it was gaining momentum, and I think it was gaining momentum to the point that even Dick Show, he thought that Riley was somehow working with Eric somehow, and it was sort of this funny thing, and it would have done well, but of course Eric, who can't get under his own way, much like John and Aaron, he's driving the bus, but he's got to jump out in front of it and throw himself under it and back over himself twice. He strikes Riley for copyright. I believe it is Riley had probably cut and pasted one of the logos, Rippaverse logos, which
Very,
I
very
think,
similar. Yeah.
yeah. It could be argued he might have a case. From what I've seen, I believe maybe Rippa was in the right, but I think it was he crossed the line, in my opinion, when he DMCA struck his Twitter channel, which of course had
Absolutely. Yeah.
nothing
Yeah.
to do with it. I
Going
mean,
after
taking the
somebody for stealing your merchandise and making money off of your image is one thing. You can handle that however you want, but attacking somebody's speech platform is where you cross the line.
yeah, and as we will learn, this is a preferred method of attack by Eric. When blocking isn't enough, he will have his quote unquote team, so that way he can't say it wasn't me. He'll have
You
his
got a team of
team.
rockstar lawyers.
he has his crew do his dirty work, and
What
that
is
is they DMCA struck Riley, I think, various other characters. One that I know of is Frog Tony, who is a prominent detractor. He was also DMCA struck, I think, twice by Eric's crew through one of his subservients, uh, NDA Andrew, and people call him DMCA Andrew now behind his back. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that, all three of these characters that we're focusing on, they all get the law involved constantly. And this is now where we're focusing on Eric July's involvement with the law. He's not necessarily getting lawyers involved, but he's using the systems that are in play to underhandedly attack these people. Like, he's trying to get YouTube
Mhm.
channels taken down because of this or that. And I believe it's kind of ironic because he is the one that's constantly doing things that are, well, against the law. A shining example is his probable charity fraud. I mean, I can't prove it. I'm not smart enough. I don't have the details. I don't have the numbers. But there's a lot of evidence to prove that Eric July was making money off of a charity donation scheme to send comic books to people that, are like underprivileged and like Make-A-Wish kids, basically,
Yeah, yeah,
people
cancer
that
kids. Yeah,
aren't long for this world, to give them comic books and shit.
yeah,
My understanding is he was charging more money than he was giving the charity, so he was making this profit off of the comics, which you
yeah.
can't really
There
do in a
was this.
charity thing.
Yeah, I think that initially came from his confrontation with Nick Rekieta
Exactly, and this is where those
pre-arrest.
two extremes cross. Is Eric was so adamant, that he's innocent and stuff, that he was willing to put himself in the line of fire to go on to Nick Rekieta's stream, this hotshot lawyer, and if he can get this guy to admonish him, or well, not admonish, the other one, uh, agree with him and approve of him, then Eric July will be in the right. And Nick, even on his stream, is like, okay, look, I don't want to ask you some questions because
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure you're going to answer in a way that's going to be bad for you.
yeah,
So we're going to move on to other things. And Eric's like, no, 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 no. I want to answer anything. And
yeah. He
almost
put him. Yeah,
self-incriminated
exactly.
himself.
Yeah,
He said some things that he immediately had to backpedal on, and you could see Nick Rekieta's face whenever he's admitting to these, well, allegations. And he's just like,
yeah.
I told you I didn't want to talk about this
yeah,
guy.
clear potential for admitting wrongdoing on his part, and it sort of initially, I think, it also Eric had gone on there also to confront Nick, because they had constant back and forth. And one of the issues is Nick is Dick's friend,
In
and
real life
Dick
and
had,
as the
yeah,
character, both his characters and in real life.
yeah, and Nick didn't admonish Dick for daring to criticize Eric. He didn't do enough to go after. And I believe that Nick also received a night letter from Eric. You're not
Shocking.
doing enough to defend me. The let's see, where was I going? Oh yeah, using the law. And right now, currently, what is happening is Riley went to an event. He was protesting, but unbeknownst to Riley, there was a warrant for his arrest, one warrant, and it was due to a harassment. And I don't know much about it, something about Texas law. And since that had
So
happened.
the basic gist of the initial warrant is because a couple months ago, right around the time with the Isom Grave incident, Riley was down in Plano, Texas. He was taking pictures and trolling Eric, and he found Eric's public warehouse, went to the public location, and went outside filming. Being Riley, whether you like Riley or not, everything he's doing is very on the edge of legal. You can hate him and
Mhm.
disagree with him morally and think he's a fucking asshole, but everything he's doing is legal. So he went
Mhm.
to the public location and he went to the front door of his warehouse and he taped money to it. He taped two $20 bills and a $1 bill because Eric July was ignoring Riley's super chats in chats and other things on YouTube. He was ignoring Riley. So Riley went to his warehouse and he taped money to the door and he said, "Ignore this asshole," or something like that. Ignore this chat, because he literally taped money to his door with text, so he can't ignore it because it's physical.
Yeah,
So
he drew
he
bunnies
took
on
that
him.
as
Yeah.
a slight. He took that as an attack. He took that as him stalking him, even though all of this stuff is public. And like I said, you can disagree with him morally or whatever. You get a restraining order.
Yeah.
But you filing all of this stuff, and a piece of evidence Eric used to go to the police with was a picture of Riley with his big giant novelty scissors in a parking lot of a Ross's uh, Dress for Less, one of those like discount clothes stores. He was
Yeah.
standing outside of a Ross with his scissors, And Eric July sent that to the police, saying that he was outside of his warehouse, lying to the police, allegedly, that that Riley was outside with these scissors threatening to attack him when it was across town at a Ross
Yeah,
earlier in the day.
and the thing is that I believe what is currently is going on now is the basis of the law. I think people are discussing and having conversation with is that, what did he do specifically? And I think that in Texas law, because everyone's bashing Texas now because
Mhm.
Eric was able to get away with this, but he had somehow used some sort of loophole or something where he was able to put a warrant on Riley for harassment. And I believe, I'm just going off the cuff, that these laws were in place to protect women from abusive husbands, something of that nature,
Well, everybody
or
knows
something like that.
Riley and Eric July are married. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, and the thing is that these warrants were issued on the day that Eric had received a reward from the Northwoods Institute. And I think that what initially Eric had, he had anticipated that Riley would show up to his awards show, and that then, he could then get Riley arrested there. But of course,
He was also previously
yeah, that,
touting Texas law that if Riley showed up, he was legally allowed to basically murder him.
yeah, to air him
He
out.
to aerate him, to ventilate him, using all sorts of novelty terms to basically describe putting a bunch of holes in Riley, which, if you know anything about human anatomy, we don't like, and we usually don't live through that.
Yeah, he was basically, he was basically going to the point of, I have a legal stance to kill this person for making fun of me, which is, absolutely ridiculous. But of course, Eric July is so
Insane.
removed from this, he probably believes it. And this is
I
just
believe
getting
he also has a lot of yes man gassing him up. Like,
yeah, exactly.
people think Eric July might be mentally handicapped, and I don't necessarily see any evidence of that. I think he's just an idiot. But I think he has a lot of yes man telling him he can do things and propping him up, and a lot of people he trusts that are
Hmm.
dumber than him.
Yeah, and it's the thing is that
A good example is
yeah.
Aaron Imholte trusting his co-host Johnny Crutches to know how to work computers and how that a SSD is inferior to hard disks because they're prone to crashing. Everybody knows that. It's just a fact of them.
Yeah.
So it's a parallel that these dumb people have even dumber people that they lean on because it's the only people that pay them any sort of respect.
Yeah, and Eric has sort of painted himself to this corner that now he is locked with Riley legally now that they have to go to court. And I think Riley is now currently raising money to do that. I think it's freeriley.fund or something of that nature to help.
FreeRiley.fund, FUND.
Yeah, to help pay for his um, legal stuff. But as far as having it to go this far, it does come off as completely underhanded. But again, the pattern persists, where Eric then states, I had nothing to do with this. I didn't call the cops on him. And even as we see through Mint Stream, we have Eric employees. One guy, Laser Eyes Brandon, tries to, front to Riley. He tries
Hey
to
man,
puff
you
his
need to
chest up at
bounce.
him. Yeah. Which is ironically in the comic book, that very line, "You need to bounce." And Riley was
Yeah.
at the event. He was not trespassing. He was just
No, so to frame this for the listeners, Eric July was basically at a comic book signing, where he could sell comic books and sign merchandise and, meet and greet people. So
yeah.
the location was at a public restaurant, I believe. It
Yes.
was at a public business during public hours. Riley was outside on the public sidewalk of the public business after Eric July kind of invited him to the event.
Yeah,
He's
there's
told Riley multiple times to pull up, to show up. Come on, we'll talk about this. Just show up. He encourages people directly to come and confront him. And then when Riley comes in, doesn't even confront him. He's outside of the building. He is, whether you agree with it or not, he's bothering people that are going inside the building. He's asking them about ISOM. He's handing out ISOM as a parody of the guy inside. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if
What's your
you,
favorite part?
my personal opinion on the situation is, yeah, Riley maybe crossed the line and was an asshole in this situation. So if Eric July felt any type of way, he should have went to the owner of the building he was in and said, "Hey man, can you go trespass this guy? Can you go have them removed from the property?"
Yeah. Well, the
That's
thing
all you have to
is
do.
that
You have
yeah,
him go outside and one time ask him, "Hey sir, I'm going to have to ask you to just can you go over there? Can you please get off of our property?" He can't kick him out of the mall. He can't kick him out of the little area he's in. The whole area is public. Eric definitely underhandedly had the police called because he knew that Riley already had a warrant because he underhandedly served him this warrant.
exactly. Yeah, that's where I would have gone, and was the establishing of the warrant. I felt was very underhanded. I mean, we're not legal people.
Not at all.
We
No.
can't argue that legally. But the point is, it looks very underhandedly. And I think that initial thing was sort of it sort of felt like Eric had, not Eric initially, but Eric through his people and his, being gaslit, as you had said, through his yes men, had baited Riley into this sort of trap that was ready to spring at any moment. And Riley, of course, was unaware of it, because through one of the, I guess, the loopholes is that the state of Texas, I don't believe, is not obligated to let
To
him know
inform the
that there
person
are
being, yeah,
that they
I don't
have
know how that works.
warrants. I guess because of this specific warrant, or this specific type, like I said, I believe that this is a law that is used for something else, and I think it's just being misdirected by Eric to basically silence his critics, and it's very ugly and disgusting now, and I
He's using a sort of loophole to attack people.
yes, yeah,
Which is something that Stuttering John does. For a
yeah,
while, he was trying to get the Shirley channel struck down because they were playing the song that John uses in his intro, because John owns the copyright to it. So he's using the DMCA music loophole in YouTube, where you don't even basically have to prove anything. You just say, "Hey, that's wrong," and YouTube says, "Oops, my bad. We'll take it down right now. Gotcha, boss." And then
yeah, it's
the person who had it taken down has to prove that they're innocent. It's a backward
yeah.
ass system, and John knows that and uses it constantly to attack people.
Yeah, it's an abuse of the terms of service. Um, when there, you can argue whether or not they're in the wrong or not, but the point is, with this is sort of like an abuse of the terms of service, but except as sort of, using the legal system in a way that
Right, it's
Eric
not how
had
that was
then
intended to be
gone after.
used, and he's
Yeah,
weaponizing that small bit of power that he has.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is that, initially Riley, Eric, one of the initial claims is that his warehouse is private property. It's not.
It's not.
Riley had gotten the address through the DMCA strike, because with the
Mm-hmm.
DMCA strike, the address of
Right,
the
because you
person
legally have to
striking
give
you
out your
is,
information whenever
yeah,
you're attacking somebody like this.
and that's where Riley got the warehouse address, and even when Eric had talked to Nick, he had tried to, I guess, dance around the fact that his warehouse is public and that it's accessible, and that back and forth. And I kind of want to, like, a little bit, like, wrap up a bit on Eric, and I want to focus on Aaron right now. Do you have any closing thoughts on Eric?
No, not really. I don't think his comic books are very good, and I don't think he's a good businessman. And both of those kind of bleed over into him being a shitty person. He has enough parallels to these other people, despite being an arguable success. He is a shithead.
Yeah, if
That's all
he
I have to
had
say about
just
him.
if he had just moved differently, he could have kept that Comicsgate audience and could have had, 3 million every single issue, but he had not. And it's just through his self-destructive behavior, as we see paralleled with John and Aaron. I want to get into Aaron a bit more as well, because, like I had said before, I was a Steel Toe fan.
And
I
self-destructive behavior
yeah,
really describes Aaron.
yeah,
Everything he does is very self-destructive.
yeah,
Um, April, liker or disliker, was a part of the Steel Toe Morning Show for quite a while.
mhm.
Aaron kind of put her as the titular co-host, and she was there almost every episode that she could bother to show up. Um, and if you've ever worked with your significant other at a job, it is very taxing on your relationship if you aren't built for that. And they clearly were not.
Well, this comes into Aaron's character flaws. That much like I feel like where I made the initial comparison that he is the leftovers of two better prototypes. Um, Aaron, as we're seeing through the history dug up by Melton, is that Aaron has had this pattern of behavior of being a parody of a man. I remember, I think it was with this initial, like the Matt character, the his sidekick. Matt used to have his own show, Savage Thoughts podcast or whatever, and he was this very masculine type of character. And then somehow he got it in his idea that because Aaron was on the radio, Aaron was more official, like higher up, higher on the upper tier, sort of like John and KB sort of relationship.
Yeah,
And he
these
had let
people weirdly worship radio.
yeah, it's this old legacy. I is that the right word? Legacy media or old
Yeah, I
media?
mean, it kind of is. I mean, it's still out there, but I mean,
It's not
um,
the powerhouse it once
I'm
was.
30 years old, and when even when I'm driving, if I'm not listening to something on my phone, my car the radio's not even on. I don't listen to that
Yeah,
because it's just
yeah,
nothing but
yeah,
ads. It's an antiquated, outdated, archaic media. It still exists, but it's on the way out. And anyone that you know takes control of their entertainment, why would I listen to something that I don't want to listen to when I
yeah.
have everything I want to listen to at my fingertips?
Yeah, there is still this prestige attached to it for some reason. Even in my other in the paranormal community, I mean, radio is still worshipped, even though podcast has probably surpassed it in a way. You know, it's like we still have these personalities who are on the radio and they still see themselves as upper tier official legacy media types that like to lord that over their lesser podcast brethren, even though the podcast people could be, financially more stable and successful than them. But it's
Exactly. I
this
was
sort
gonna
of
say that part. I feel like they might see it because they get paid for it and they might have a good steady income off of it. But I mean, some of these people they make money off of ads if they do ads. Then they make money off of YouTube if they do the YouTube because if they monetize their channel. And then not to mention a lot of these channels have Patreons where you can give money almost directly to the creators. So they have three streams of income right there. Plus, they might have merchandise. Plus, they might do live shows. So they have all of this income. And sure, maybe one of those checks isn't as big as their one check, but they arguably have more stable and a more diverse income with a more stable and diverse fan base. I don't personally see how radio can be held higher than podcasting and stuff like that. But I didn't really grow up on it. Aaron
yeah, yeah.
clearly did, and because he was on the radio and he still runs the Steel Toe Morning Show, which he pretends is radio. He even talks it in his like radio voice. Like I can almost guarantee he doesn't do that voice all day long. I mean, maybe he does. I mean, maybe I'm like Carl, and I'm just giving Aaron the benefit of the doubt and thinking that that's not who he is all the fucking time. But please, I would hope that he does not talk like that all the time.
He probably does. I would assume
Probably.
he would. But the thing
Probably.
is that Aaron is this sort of like he is this old dinosaur, but his behavior is his undoing. Even through the radio stuff, he got himself kicked off the radio because he yelled at one of the other personalities, and it was like a pregnant woman over some dumb shit. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, his behavior got him thrown out of the industry that he claims to covet so much. So he's not even a radio person. calling himself that. Again, he is mocking, or he is parodying what he thinks, a man is, what he thinks a radio personality is. He is aping that. And I think
It's like
with
a soldier who is dishonorably discharged calling themselves still an active enlisted soldier and pretending like they still uphold all of those morals.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
parody. They're pretending to be
mhm.
something.
Yeah, it's sort of, and that is sort of like he's taking stolen valor from like radio prestige, and he's not on the radio. He got himself kicked out of radio. Even if it is a dinosaur media, he's no longer part of it. And like Stuttering John, the parallel there, he latches onto it for relevancy. Because with Stuttering John, it's always, I was on the Tonight Show, I was on this, and you could ask a person today on the streets, do you know who Jay Leno is? Do you know what the Tonight Show is? Even I would even go so far as say, do you know who Howard Stern is? This is sort of this niche stuff where, yeah, it's a big deal for those of us that grew up with it and those of us who learn about it. But I think the, average person, the normie, they're not going to know what the hell it is that we're talking about.
No, absolutely not. I remember years ago somebody asked me like they were talking just offhanded about Opie and Anthony, and they asked me if I ever listened to it, and I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It honestly sounds like it's like a cartoon show or something like that. I have no idea who you're talking about or what you're talking about. And now I couldn't imagine not knowing who Opie and Anthony is because they're so big of the part of the universe that I'm in. So they're
Yes.
big to the people who know about it, but generally speaking, no, nobody knows, nobody cares, and that's kind of steel toe. Whatever fans he still have left love him, and the people who used to like him still remember those times fondly. Like my co-host on my show, What Is This Game? His name is Dylan. He used to be a big fan of Steel Toe, and uh, when I've talked to him, he doesn't necessarily give me a reason as to why. He just looks back on it and is like, oh, I used to like the show. It's like, okay, I mean, that's to each their own. Sometimes I can't tell
Mhm.
you why I like shows.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the thing is, I mean, Aaron does have that audience, and I feel that's sort of what he used to get himself that deal of with Kumia, where even Eric Nagel, Erock, he even admitted, yeah, Aaron brought people in, and that was probably that Minnesota audience, and at the time, lead hanger-ons from the Dabbleverse, because at the time he was still good with them, and it's just this sort of like, he's this sort of the dinosaur character, that this parody of a man. People make fun of him for wearing a chest binder, because he's got his moobs hanging out. And I seen a picture where he was boxing, or he was like leaning on the mat, and he has these stick legs that are like, I mean, literally stick legs that are much thinner than Carl's chicken legs. I mean, this guy, he props himself as a sort of blue collar working man, radio professional. But since he's been left to his own devices, his show is barely watchable. It's technically barely uh, a show. He's practically just turning on a camera and pointing at him. His background has changed, and it's looks like a hobbled together basement rather than a proper show setting. And as
Like,
far as
I,
what he
I don't want to
claims
prop
he
myself
was,
up, but
yeah.
like my room is just a collection of my posters and crap laying here, and this isn't like a studio or whatever. Aaron's is trying to be like a radio set, whatever that is, radio sound. You don't get to see those sets. I mean, unless you watch like the old clips on YouTube and stuff, and you can see the room that they're in, but that's not really a
Mhm.
set. That's a control room that has mics in it and whatever. He's trying to have like this whole like cool backdrop and stuff, and it looks worse than my collection of crap.
Yeah, and the thing is that he is touting himself as this professional, but the more and more that is taken away from him via his own behavior, the more that he loses, the more that exposed that he was a fraud the entire time. much like
Yeah,
Eric
he has had all
July.
these connections and squandered them, much like Stuttering
Yes.
John. Like he had the
Yeah.
Kumia connection, and I mean, he doesn't do anything with that. He had the Carl connection and did nothing with that.
Hmm.
He could have had a connection with all of the dabble like focused people. He could have had Chad on, and they could have went against people together. He could have had Ray DeVito. He could have even had John on it, and they could have went after people together. But he doesn't capitalize on any of his success that he has had, and
Yeah, I
constantly,
thought you
as
were
you
talking
said,
about
is
John for a
just
second.
self-destructing. Exact
Yeah.
sound. It's very similar. They have all of this potential, and they just constantly squander it because they have no real talent. Like you said, they're a fraud. They had nothing to
Yeah.
begin with, and they just fall into these situations that they can't capitalize on. And it turns out that they shouldn't have been there to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. And we see this with Aaron. We see this with John. Well, with John, it's more pronounced because he's been at it longer than the other two, as far
And
as
he
we
also
know.
doesn't shut up about his career.
Yeah, and we're seeing this now with Eric, with where he is going through his downfall arc, which some would argue, but the Ripitards are becoming less and less, and we can see it from his initial, like the Yair. Okay, the first campaign, ISOM did 3 million, but he had everyone in his corner cheering for him on principle.
Mhm.
And then the second one didn't perform as well because people were leading off like, oh, I don't know if I should be this loyal to this guy. He's he's gone against my people. He's gone against all this stuff. And then Yairo was sort of like, I guess, his best case scenario, quote unquote, on his own. And I think it barely scraped by over 1 million. And then now we have Gooding, which should be a sort of like, this is a character from, like, I think the second ISOM book,
Mhm.
and it's a solo thing, and it's barely passed over 100,000, which is like, that is an astronomical drop from 1 million to like 100,000. That is telling, in my opinion, of this
It's telling
absolute,
of a
what I would
couple of
consider,
things.
downfall. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you have anything to expand on that?
Um, I I think it's telling of the lack of content of the characters that are being introduced and then adapted and expanded on. Um, the scene of Isom being thrown slash dropped into a car is used in every single piece of this media so
Yeah,
far,
that's the
and
most
it's like
that's the most iconic moment of the character. That's the most memorable moment of the character, is being dropped on his ass.
yes, none of these characters from the first two books are memorable outside of Isom, and yet all of them are getting more content, more exposure, more notoriety than Isom himself.
Yeah,
Why?
and there's
Well, because he was sued by the church that he stole the name of, and
mhm,
they kind of said, "Hey, you got to cease and desist on this Isom shit, or rename your character." So
yeah,
currently, Isom's kind of ground to a halt, and he has to expand on everybody else, which
yeah,
none of these characters are fleshed out because they were all side characters to begin with.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is that even though with a lot of it's arguable that he has professionals, industry professionals, working on this stuff, even they cannot squeeze blood from the stone, because they're pretty much working with less than nothing. He claimed, at first he claimed he's going to rival DC and Marvel, and then that fell through, and now he's claiming, oh no, my competition is manga. And it's like, even that,
What?
and again, I'm a fan of manga, but the mangas that he compares himself to is like volume 17 of an established title. It's like, yeah, there's going to be like, you could probably measure yourself against that. Whereas, if you look at volume ones, they sold gangbusters and even surpassed, Marvel and DC in sales. And it's this back and forth, and it's just, he's constantly postulating that he is this successful comic book man character. He has his friends, one of them, JDA, John Della Rose, who touted him with the iconic line, "He is the Black Stan Lee," and it's just, and even though I agree on principle with a lot of JDA stances here and there on selectively, I do feel like he is sort of bending the knee a little too hard to Eric's ego, and his hanger-ons are becoming less and less, and it's becoming more laughable. It's going to be to the point now that Eric is going to be Stuttering John, where his only audience is the trolls. His only audience is going to be the detractors that are going to support him on the grounds of just to make fun of him, just to farm content from him.
Right, because he does not take any sort of people that are actually trying to help him. He accepts the advice and the opinions of his yes men, but they are only there because Eric allows them to, and they're not there for
They're
his
there until the
improvement. They're
check
not
clears.
there. They're there for a paycheck if they get one.
Yes.
And I feel
Yeah.
bad for Eric that he's got these people mooching off of him. He's,
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
said, he's arguably a big success, but he has no way to capitalize on it because he is so busy caught up defending every mistake he's ever made.
Yeah. And the thing is, I mean, I'm waiting for the point when we're going to see a book, if he even reaches that point, where the next book is going to be headlined by Renowned Zero and LG, which are his two, net net boys, which is like they're what they are to Eric is what Clay Dabbler and the Legend or whatever Penis Wrinkle is to Stuttering John. They're sort of his supporters, his valiant defenders. And I'm just waiting for them to get their own book soon, from the Rippaverse, if it's still around. And that's the thing is that, there is a measurable timeline or a clock that is clearly ticking down, because the warehouse, which is his fortress of solitude, you got to pay rent on it, and you got to pay your employees, and that's not something that he can, like Aaron can just squander and pretend to have. That's physical resources that are constantly depleting that cost him. And I think soon we're going to
Absolutely, and
see that
and
shut
he
up.
can only pretend and push it off for so long.
Yeah.
Some of those people might stick around just on merit and just on belief and just on faith or friendship, but some of those
Yes.
people are going to be like, "Hey, man, you're not paying me anymore. I got to go."
Yeah. 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 And I'm just waiting for the time when that warehouse door closes. And I guess for the time we'll sort of like wrap up here, if that's good with you, because I think I wanted to go for like an hour. We've gone over that because there's so much to talk about on this. But
Absolutely, you could talk about
yeah.
these people all day.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
they're none of them are radio, but they're all TV. It's all a
Yeah.
fascinating show. It is full of entertainment where you can find it. You
Yeah.
have to be able to
And
laugh at this because otherwise the whole situation is sadness and it's just depressing and misery all around. And
yeah, desperation.
people that have so much luck and fortune, opportunity, and a network of support and opportunity. I said that, but
Yeah, just squandering it.
they just fuck it up constantly.
Exactly. Yeah. So thank you for coming on to this show. And
Thank you for
the
having me.
initial purpose of the show was to compare and contrast three characters in relation to one another and how they echo each other. We could go on and on about their individual dramas, but there are better shows that do that. I recommend the Uncle Rico show, Nobody Loves Onions. Even if WATP, of course, if you want the best in Aaron and John, Carl really doesn't dive into the Eric stuff because I don't think he has a footing in that world. But he has privately talked to me about it, about what is there, and he finds it fascinating. He just can't find a foothold in it. But there are many other, like as far as the Eric show, I recommend. I think it's Frog Tony Gaming with Geeks. His channel is very good, and there you will find a series of detractors like Katie did, who does clips of for all these shows to farm this drama. As
Yeah,
far
and they're
as
smaller names and they
yeah,
deserve a little bit of a bump. I was going to recommend Biggest Problem, but they have enough support and promotion. So yeah, if you're looking for
yeah,
some more in-depth and niche Eric July stuff, then yeah, go
yeah,
look for Frog Tony.
yeah. I like the Dick Show. I mean, I as much as I, you know, go after Vito, on Twitter and stuff and make fun of him. He is pretty funny. He can't get out of his own way sometimes. Dick Dot Show. He's a great character. I feel that his Eric drama is more interesting than his Maddox stuff, because the Maddox stuff, it's funny, but it feels like two old ladies
Antiquated and it's
yelling at each other at
personal.
this point. Yeah. Maddox is his Joker, but Eric is sort of his Bane, which is sort of a
A much
more,
more fun villain to fight.
yeah, definitely. So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Let everybody know where they can find you and what you got going on.
Well, you can find me every Wednesday live on WATP. I'm the review girl there. I come on at the end of the show with Carter Electric to play the game and read reviews. But I also do my own show. I host What Is This Game, a YouTube podcast where Dylan from Somewhere and I talk every once in a while about a game we've been playing. We have an episode coming up on the 3rd of next month, whatever that is, July. The 3rd of July, we'll be recording an episode on Hades. And then a couple weeks later, on the 17th, we'll be coming back to talk about Prey 2017. So you can find that on youtube.com/at WITGS. That is What Is This Game? And then show. So WITGS.
All right. And thank you for coming on. Like I said, we could talk for hours about this stuff, but this was just initial compare and contrast. And thank you so much for joining me on this and bringing all your knowledge onto this. I really appreciate it greatly.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you having me.